Oh my God, I love it here. I love it here. I love the ranch. I know. Kathy was like, maybe they'll just hire me to live here and start an architecture program.
I think that would be cool to my grandma. Maybe she could teach architecture.
Well, she could.
I'm gonna talk to her.
Yeah. The architecture
Yeah.
program.
We'll set it up.
Done. Done and done. You're still filtering in, so.
Yeah, she really did. I like it. You guys have a lot of legislation connection.
I can see it.
Have you ever seen anybody so lovely?
No.
Yeah, it scared the shit out of me.
Okay, I'm gonna introduce you.
Okay, wait a little bit. It's only
Yeah,
2
but
minutes out.
yeah.
I'm gonna show the show. So you can say she heard.
All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Anderson Ranch. My name is Andrea Wallace. I'm the director of photography here. Before we get started, I'd like to ask everyone to silence their cell phones. I also want to start by recognizing that Anderson Ranch, I have to put my glasses on. No, I got it. Anderson Ranch campus resides on the historic tribal lands of the Ute people, who called this area home for over 800 years. In honor of this legacy, we focus on building an inclusive community here, maintaining this as a place of inspiration and creativity in the Rocky Mountains. And just also a reminder, after Kathy's presentation, we will have a Q&A, so just kind of hold your questions until the end. So what do I say about a leading artist in contemporary photography, or the leading artist? Kathy Opie was born in Sandusky, Ohio, and now lives and works in LA. She received her MFA from the California Institute of the Arts and is an artist working in photography, film, collage, and ceramics. Her work has been exhibited exclusively throughout the United States, Europe, and Japan, including a mid-year career survey at the Guggenheim. She was a recipient of the Guggenheim Fellowship in 2019, the Smithsonian's Archives of American Art Medal in 2016, a United States Artist Fellowship in 2006, and the list goes on. She was a professor of photography. She's retired from the University of California at LA, UCLA. And her work is shown nationally and internationally at countless prestigious institutions. I was reading it today on Hyperallergic, and there's a quote that says, "From snapshots to resplendent studio photographs, she draws us powerfully into her lifelong project of bearing witness to her community." She also, and I hope she'll tease us with some images tonight, has her first solo exhibition at MASP in Brazil, and I hope you're going to show images of that because it's really beyond. It's amazing. I also want to say that Kathy is just a gem of a human being, and I'm so glad that she's a friend of the ranch and she's here tonight. Please welcome Kathy Opie.
All right, give it up for the ranch. How many people are here are philanthropists? Huh? How many philanthropists in this room? Okay, give to the ranch, give to the ranch, give to the ranch, give to the ranch. I love this place. I don't know how many years I've been coming now. Yeah, probably a decade, I guess. You know, I was a camp counselor for far too long. I started being a camp counselor when I was 15, and I did it all the way up until 21, 22 years of age. And so coming here is an extension of my inner camp counselor that is still very big in me today. So we are going to start out tonight. I'm going to traverse you not through my entire career, but we're going to give you a little bit of highlights of how I think about photography. But really, this lecture is on what I've been doing the last 5 years. So those who haven't seen a lecture in a while will be able to see how I'm thinking about all these different bodies of work. So it starts here, though, in front of my house in Sandusky, Ohio, where I asked my parents for a camera for my 9th birthday. And this is my very first self-portrait with that camera. Definitely a baby butch. My favorite thing about the flowered pants is the zipper's half down. But this kind of, in a certain way, when I rediscovered these negatives of when I was 9 years old and I kind of looked through that body of work, I was like, oh, I'm still doing exactly the same thing. So obviously, portraits at 9 years old were also performative, but also definitely in relationship to a performance of masculinity, and the inner butch is there strong. Justin Bond. The early portraits throughout the 90s was the beginning for me to figure out what is my relationship to documentary photography. And what is it, the kind of terms of going into the studio and leaning into a history of painting, and particularly with this body of work in the 90s, it was Holbein. So really thinking about what my community was, because at this point we had gone through the culture wars, we had gone through Jesse Helms holding up images in Congress in relationship to Mapplethorpe. The NEA4 was already kind of happening and going down. But the main thing was that my community was completely being decimated by AIDS. So what is my relationship to bearing witness to my own community and creating a different kind of portrait, a different kind of relationship to humanity? This is Miguel. Miguel weighed about 95 pounds for this portrait and died the week after of AIDS. And the other thing was I wanted to make my community remember what it was that we were living through. Then as I said, this is just like really quick through various bodies of work. So leading after the studio, leaning back into what documentary was, Peter Galassi did this very important show called Pleasure and Comfort in Fuck, I'm gonna fuck up this title. Never mind. Pleasure and never mind. Anyway, he did this show and it had no queers in it. So everybody was shooting 8:10 in the 90s. I went out on a road trip for 3.5 months photographing lesbian domesticity. So these are all staged with an 8:10 camera, and I went throughout the United States in doing it. Miggy and Eileen. Eileen was the creator of the L Word. And this was right before the twins were born, the day before the twins came. And this is self-portrait nursing. There's a trilogy of self-portraits. It's self-portrait cutting on my back, self-portrait pervert, and self-portrait nursing, I feel is somewhat of a trilogy of self-portraits that connote different parts of my life in relationship to identity. I'm obviously playing with the Madonna and Child. I'm playing with the kind of tropes of art history, which I often do within my work. But it's obviously an older lesbian with still the scars of pervert on my chest and marks on my body. And what that does in relationship to thinking about Madonna and Child is a way to transform what is our relationship to both culture and visual history, and how do we think about it in terms of how it creates a certain idea of what art is within our society. Oliver in a tutu. Oliver's now 22 and living in New York City. His favorite thing in the world at this age, which is about 3 years old, was doing laundry at the house. And I was making a body of work called In and Around Home. And so there he is, stuffing the laundry, you know, wearing what he normally would wear, trotting around the house, his favorite outfit, and stuffing clothes. And I caught him in that moment. And I was shooting this body of work with a Mamiya 7. I wanted it to be handheld. I wanted to document the home in a different way. I didn't want to reach into like large format. I wanted the looseness of what that kind of medium format begins to do within a body of work. This is from a body of work that preceded the Snowball one, preceded In and Around Home, but they ended up being a book together. And it's a book titled 1999 In and Around Home. And in 1999, our quaint fear at that point was Y2K. And some of you who are a different generation don't remember Y2K, but we literally thought all of our information was going to go away once 2000 rolled around. And so I went on a road trip through America thinking about Robert Frank and what the Great American Road Trip was, but I was just kind of paying attention to American vernacular. So the hand-painted signs, well, we all just go back to the American vernacular to a certain extent. And then this image of fireworks is the Renditori in Venice, Italy, where they've celebrated on the same day the end of the plague. And so this idea of also, you know, pageantry and celebration of culture in these different ways I find very interesting. I went to Venice thinking I could make a body of work around Canaletto. So I'm often like chasing what I think will be interesting to have a conversation with. So I spent 6 weeks in Venice trying to make a body of work thinking of what Canaletto saw at that time period, and it was a failure. And I really am interested in also when artists fail within their work. And I finally did one successful body of work that you'll see tonight that I feel is successful, that's outside of America. And I think that when Jennifer Blessing, like, which I think is a fabulous title for an exhibition, titled me American Photographer, I think it was one of those titles that I was like, well, yeah, I am very American. I am a photographer. I have dealt with American identity forever in all these different ways. But am I allowed to look at other cultures and other countries? And can I do that without being from a kind of colonialist kind of point of view of what photography does? And so Venice was, I took this photograph, which I love, but the rest of them aren't that good. This is a really interesting one in relationship to the idea of nature that's paired next to, and these pairs happen also in the Fiden book. So about 3 years ago, right when the pandemic happened, I made my first kind of large coffee table monograph that Fiden printed. And so a lot of these pairings come from the book, but it was the first time that I didn't do chronology in a book. I did the relationship of the bodies of work to one another. So here we have a landscape that you can't see, and I'm always challenging National Geographic. Like, I love National Geographic and I hate National Geographic. I have this very interesting relationship with Nat Geo photographers in all these different ways. So in this photograph, which you can't see, in here is a pack of wolves. So this print is 40 by 60, so you see it when you have the print, but you'll never see it in projection. But it's a pack of wolves surrounding a baby grizzly bear. And so normally in a Nat Geo photograph, you would see the action of the grizzly, you know, and defending itself against the wolf. But it's like, this is how nature works, you guys. It works like this, where you're not like in a zoom lens in a scene. And then I traveled the country for 3 years photographing high school football players as an extension of the American landscape. So how do we think about landscape and identity? And so high school football players were a very interesting moment in which that I wanted to really think about not just how do we define American landscape, but also this relationship to American landscape at a time under a Bush administration. We're at war with Iran and Iraq, and everything like that is going on in Afghanistan. And what, you know, most of these high school football players are often soldiers. They leave high school and they go off to be soldiers. And so I wanted to bear witness to another vulnerable community in a certain way. This is from In and Around Home. And this was a house in West Adams in my neighborhood, and I did a body of work pretty much just around West Adams, in which there were 32 registered sex offenders living in this house. And the neighbors protested. And so this is a blonde news reporter and a brunette news reporter. Jenny Shimutsu from a body of work called Girlfriends, which I had made the body of work of high school football players, and everybody was like, wow, Kathy, that's really masculine for you. Is this tying in with your butch identity in some ways? And I'm like, actually it has nothing to do with my butch identity. And then I was like, okay, you want to see butch identity? Here we go. And so the body of work Girlfriends also is a play with Richard Prince's idea of girlfriends in relationship to his body of work. But they were all like gangs of biker chicks. So I was kind of having a little verbal twist with Richard Prince within this too. And then the surfer body of work I made in 2001 after I made a body of work called Ice Houses. And it's all just in between sets of waves, and it's just about like the community gathering within this landscape. They're shot 8 by 10. The horizon line is kept completely in the middle. I'm always challenging what's the relationship between the vertical and the horizontal in relationship to landscape. That verticality also connotes kind of portraiture to a certain extent, where the horizon or the horizontal is always kind of placed within the idea of landscape. And so I like pushing and pulling that. And what happens when all 14 prints are lined up with the horizon line in the middle is that it becomes also a fractured panorama, because I've shot a lot with panorama cameras too. So I'm really interested in these different moments where you fracture or puncture the relationship to how we think about landscape. Abstract landscape, these are all from national parks, and they're all untitled, because I found that when I was making this body of work, it was the abstracts came into play with the portraits on black, and I wanted that whole body of work to be kind of a cognitive relationship to the pause and what we don't know and what we know. And so we go to the Grand Canyon and people take out their cell phones, they take a picture of it, they get in their car and they drive off. Is that really knowing a landscape? What does that landscape serve, you know? So I was really playing with it by just racking the focus of the lens. It's also what the landscape looks like when I remove my glasses, which is really hokey, but that's just the truth of the matter as well. Mini malls were made in 1995, 96, right after I made freeways. I was still really interested in the panorama and the specificity of identity of American cities, and a very large body of work I've made of American cities all consist of black and whites made with a 7 by 17 inch banquet camera. So the negative is actually 7 by 17 inches. And the specificity of the mini mall for me is the way that we enter LA through the mom and pop shops, that it shows the community of immigrants, that it shows like the different relationship to the city of how community builds neighborhoods all through the facade of the mini mall, which is very different than master plan communities where it's the, you know, Noah Bagels and the Jamba Juice and the Starbucks. So what is this kind of relationship to the idea of connoting neighborhood through the facade in the same way that I connote identity through the body? I look at both the architecture and the body, and I look at buildings as bodies and bodies as architecture of identity built. And I'm very interested in how the fluidity of that happens through the various bodies of work of mine. This is shot on Wall Street. This was 2 weeks before 9/11 happened. These are the last moments of the towers. It just happened to be a bright, sunny Sunday morning where the towers end up looking like ghosts. And I went to California to move and buy a house, and I was still living in New York, and 9/11 happened. I was pregnant with Oliver, and I came back to a completely different Wall Street. And it's so interesting because photography for me is about building a history and also an archive, right? So we always think in some ways, like when we go back and we look at Adjay photographs or August Sander photographs or these different moments within history of how we understand how to look at things culturally, we're really kind of blown away at the idea that that moment happened 100 years ago. And so a lot of different bodies of work like American Cities are built thinking that these things will stand in time. And so it really interestingly skewed my idea and relationship to what photography is as a document when this happened, and this was already history within 2 weeks after making it. And so what happens with that then? And how do you hold those moments? And how do you think about how that changes the way that you approach also documentary? And I think that it was really profound for me, actually, to think that this image was, you know, one of the last images of the foot of the towers in a certain way. Chicago, the specificity of identity for that American city was how they light the architecture at night. So I predominantly photographed for 3.5 months at night, photographing the various areas of Chicago. American Cities kind of finished when I had Oliver. So I had him in 2002, and I kept planning to finish it. And I probably will now that he's launched and go back out with the 717 because there's multiple cities that I haven't been able to do yet. So it'll be interesting to dig back into it because I kind of ended it in 2001. And then when I was pregnant with him, continuing to photograph, and then the camera became too hard. And the amount of time you have to spend in these cities, you have to invest like 3 months of your life, and I couldn't do that any longer. So it's interesting also how work changes you when you're being a full-time mom and a full-time professor. The Four Seasons of Lake Michigan. The one that's to the, you know, this one is supposed to be winter. They held the exhibition up for 2 years to wait for Lake Michigan to freeze for me, and it never froze. I had done all the panoramas, but the lake never frickin' froze. And so there's a little, in the print, there's a little bit of ice cap on the very back, but I wanted that full frozen lake. And the curator, Elizabeth Smith, who's a brilliant curator, was just like, Kathy, we can't hold it up anymore for a frozen lake. And I'm like, but it's not how I want it. And so I've never gone back and done it, even though the lake has frozen again. I kind of like that it is just what it was. And that is exactly what's also happening with our world and our climate. And so the fact that the lake didn't freeze is because lakes are not going to freeze all the time anymore. I went on a container ship from the port of Busan in Korea. I got a phone call from Hanjin Shipping, which is now bankrupt, and they were like, "You won an award." And I'm like, "Oh, I won an award. What kind of award did I win?" And they're like, "Well, we want to welcome you on one of our container ships to make a body of work. And you can choose to go from Long Beach to Busan or Busan to Long Beach." And I was like, oh, well, what's this container ship like? You know, like, how am I going to, can I bring an assistant? And so I realized that one of the things that I'm always doing with photography is, and I was talking to my students about this today, that I bump up or rub up against the cliche. I never step in the cliche, but I'm really interested in how cliche operates within photography. So on the journey, I took every sunrise and every sunset, leaving the horizon in the middle, whether or not there was a sunrise or sunset. And so it changes the way that we think maybe about sunrise and sunsets, but also time. It's a very time-based work. Portraits on Black. This is Oliver and Mrs. Nibbles. I saw two exhibitions in London that were really phenomenal, a retrospective of Da Vinci and a retrospective of Richter, both at the same time, one at the Tate, one at the National Gallery in London. And I really started thinking about what that space was of the old masters, that I've played with Holbein and that idea, but I really wanted to use the black as a kind of a subconscious space. And the figure really lit in a more kind of painterly way. This is Lawrence Weiner. Who's now no longer with us. Love that man. Another abstract. David Hockney and Thelma Golden. In my portraits, though, I don't say David Hockney. I say David, and I say Thelma. So even though I'm saying their last names, one of the things that you'll know consistently is I don't usually connote the last names in titles, because I feel like it's a personal shared moment, and it's just David to me at that moment. Ron. Rick Owens. Betty Saar. They're mainly portraits of artists and other friends. I think that one of the things that I wanted to do was I really wanted to honor these older artists that had been in my life who'd mentored me. Like, David's been incredible to me, Frank Gehry, Betty Saar. Like, there's this whole beautiful thing that happens within kind of also, even though you're not within a community of artists such as LA, which is such a teaching community, that we're all kind of there for each other. And I really felt that I needed to honor my older friends who I knew would no longer be with us soon, with also making portraits of them. So these are what I have made in the last 5 years. The Modernist, Rhetorical Landscapes, 2020, Walls, Windows, and Blood. And then I'm going to give you a sneak preview to a road trip I just finished in January and February, where I spent 20 days trying to chase the blue of the light of mountains and make portraits of mountains. So I'm going to go through each of these bodies of work pretty in depth to a certain extent, with still trying to be timely. The Modernist started out, you know what? I don't think we clicked that film one. We'll just, okay, here we go. We'll see. So this is a moment after I made the portraits and the abstract landscape, where I'm really trying to question the relationship of photography and installation. How do we deal with, media in relationship to a screen at this point? How do we get people to pause and really spend time thinking about photographs? How do I hold an audience or viewers is something, a question that I always work on. La Jetée was a really important film made in 1962 by Chris Marker. And La Jetée was a dystopic kind of film about the future and science and nuclear war at a time where nuclear threat was huge. And Chris Marker made this film all out of black and white stills, and there's one moving moment in it. And I decided to have a conversation with the fact that maybe utopia and modernism failed us. And what is it in relationship to the case study houses and the idea of a utopic vision of modernism for the people that now have just created priceless, endless, unachievable places of architecture that no longer the people can afford except for the top 1%. So the modernist begins to kind of really play with that idea. So in the beginning of the installation, you have a collage that the protagonist, who is played by Pigpen, who I've photographed for years, made as their artwork while they were burning down all the historic modernist houses of LA. So this artist went out to burn down the modernist houses, and that became their artwork. This was a theater that the architect Michael Maltson, a really amazing architect, designed for the exhibition. I wanted it to play off of modernist architecture, and I wanted the reflection of the vertical portraits, because the film is horizontal and the photographs are vertical as portraiture, to begin to play with the actual structure of the theater within the installation. This is how the theater looked. There was one sound in the entire piece, which is at the very middle of it, which is a very large, like very intense match strike that makes everybody jump in the film. And there's a moment in Chris Marker's film where it goes to film and there's a blink. And so these different moments I'm playing off of kind of in a way, but this is what the theater looked like on the inside. Here's the collage. It ends up being very much also slam poetry in a certain way, because these are all real articles from the LA Times that then I reprinted the front page of the LA Times to then include the article of whatever house was being burnt down. So it was both fake news and news at the same time during the Trump election of this time. So also really playing around with that dystopic view of California burning down. So you'll see that these kind of, so there's these different moments within the collage that are really important. This is the Eames living room, and you can see like the kind of slam poetry here says guarded plight, and then there's the image from the little boy from Aleppo that we all knew in the news that came up. So also, what are we doing with these images that pop through our lives? I mean, look at what we're going through right now, just constantly on our phones and the streaming. So that it does become like slam poetry in a way where Piggy is doing like real change at helm, scorched earth, hot property, magic tale of lost and found. And then what is that in relationship to this kind of position of both the dystopic and the utopic and the push of those? And so trying to really dig down structurally. So within the installation, there's this series of Pigpen just checking himself out in the mirror. And he felt so bad because he had an accident. He had a really bad black eye, and he scratched his face. And I'm like, hey, it works. It's okay, Piggy. Maybe that happened when you were escaping from lighting a fire, you know, like, so, but we shot it. It wasn't storyboard. It's all shot handheld. In between it, in the film, the dream sequence happens with using these reflections, where the film is structured in a certain way that you don't know if it's a dream or if it's real, and you're constantly asking yourself that. And then here's just Pigpen drawing for the collage. And buying the gas can was really funny because Piggy insisted that I like really fucked up when we went to Lowe's. And Piggy was like, Opie, the gas can's too little. It's not butch enough. Like, what's with this little gas can? And I'm like, I'm sorry, Piggy. We'll do it better. So we first have this gas can, and then it switches to that gas can. Because Pigpen is like, Opie, come on. So this is a moment in the film, the one over here on this side, where Pigpen strikes the match and this like sound happens, and then it gets very active, where Pigpen burns down the chemisphere after burning down Larry Gagosian's house. Yeah, I have a sense of humor. This is just on the precipice of the Sheets Goldstein house in LA, which is a really important Lautner house. The interesting thing is I didn't burn down the case study houses. Like, I burned down the more kind of really architectural houses that actually the 1% would have had. but there was also this idea of those architects at that time period playing with what the kind of ideas of modernism and case study brought to LA. So again, just some images from that. And then Piggy, we built models of all of the buildings, and then we actually, that was the only time where the fire was real, was in when we burnt down the models in the backyard. So this is the model we made of the chemisphere, and then Piggy's lighting it on fire. And both Piggy and I were kind of pyros as kids. Not that I lit buildings on fire, but you know, like part of being, I guess, like a tomboy was trying to play with boys and light fires because it was the 60s and 70s and we didn't have screens, so we did stupid shit. So this is Piggy kind of finishing up the collage at the end, kind of working the artist at work. And then there's a whole series of hands in flames as the photographs. And I'll probably go ahead and try to show the film in class, so I'll let other people on the ranch know, or maybe we can do a screening here somehow. So rhetorical landscapes start after I finish The Modernist. At this point, Trump is president. And I'm beginning to think about just how tragically this country is going to change and how tragic of a moment this was for the country, and especially for everything that I felt that I also worked towards politically my whole life in relationship to identity politics. And rhetorical landscapes is going around and photographing swamps in the South with then these stop motion collages that I made that are on these oversized monitors that I bought on Amazon that are really mall kiosks, but I really like that they look like the first generation of iPhones. So I wanted to talk about the history of political collage, but I wanted to do stop motion animation for that because I wanted to have a conversation with Terry Gilliam and kind of Monty Python Flying Circus of what I grew up with. But I collected a whole cross-section of magazines in America for over a year and a half and cut images out and then made these series of political collages of different themes in relationship to what the Trump administration was doing. And I can't believe they hold up now. Again, I'm gonna do a huge show of this body of work in 2020 at Davidson College in October before the election. So this is a swamp. The title Rhetorical Landscape is to play with what rhetoric does within our country, what language does. So the idea of drain the swamp, when the swamp is one of the most important ecosystems, that the swamps are actually going to be underwater. They're not going to ever be drained. We're going to lose those ecosystems within climate change. So also, what is the politics of the environment in relationship to thinking about a history of landscape photography? And I would call these swamp photographs my very bad attempts of being a National Geographic photographer. So they're amateur Nat Geo photos. And so this would be how the installation would look. It happened where the show was only open for 2 weeks because then the world shut down from the pandemic. So this is my pandemic show that never got to be seen except for 2 weeks of its life. There's a moment within this that everybody loves to discover. Ash loves this moment. There's this owl right here within the camouflage. So the other thing is just, thinking about like ideas of fakeness within photography, that AI now would put this gator in this swamp, but this is a real gator in a real swamp. And I had a question at a lecture recently that I gave where like, Kathy, how is AI going to change your photography? I said, well, not much, because I need to go out and find these things, and I'm really interested in that process of the finding, and I don't really care about talking to a computer to construct a photograph that I can't find. So the idea of just finding these moments are really important. It's also a place of meditation for me. When I get to go out and make nature photographs, it puts me in a real different space in my mind than when I'm making portraits. And swamps are thick. They're really interesting to work with in terms of depth of field. And I really like the fact that these aren't they were much more interesting to make with a 35 millimeter digital camera than a 4x5 or 8x10. They ended up not being amateur Nat Geo photos if I like upscaled my technical ability with them, and then they failed for me. So I was really trying to find this weird sweet spot of what an amateur nature photographer was or meant. Just during a rainstorm. This one is one of my favorites because it's so weird how the reflection is sharper than the actual landscape. And I kind of really love the way that that works. And there's these moments where the water moves so it almost looks like it's digitized in a way that plays with like digital abstract photography as well. So all of these would put you in this state of mind within the installation where you might be really looking at nature in this way and being in this meditative moment. And then on these monitors are these collages. To have a conversation with kind of the Bauhaus movement of photography in relationship to the grid and collage, but using stop motion, it was really important that the grid was the hand-painted grid, that the grid was not the kind of structure that we think of the architectural grid, but that the grid got broken in a certain way through this idea of what political collage is by my hand making the grid. So I have 3 collages to show you, but notice the difference of the backgrounds in them. After each collage finishes, it freezes for 30 seconds on the monitor before it goes to the next collage so that it becomes like a digital photograph on the monitor without its movement. So it returns to being kind of an idea of a place of a photograph. The next collage is in relationship to racism and white supremacy in America. We have Andrew, one of the head guys of the Proud Boys. Door slams on him. Don't shoot, hands go over. A little teeny Colin Kaepernick comes up. So I'm narrating, I'm building these collages, then I'm unbuilding them, and then I'm narrating the movement. And that's how I came about to making them, was this kind of narration of movement, of the contradictions of what's happening within America at this point in time, and what are the kind of political discourses, and how are they really going to actually create a better humanity is always the question that I'm asking. So the newsboy, the idea of the old newsboy, even though it's on a screen, like how we get information, how we get disinformation. And you'll notice this background of the grid doesn't show the hand that much. It's like doing the grid with tape. It's trying to be as precise as possible, but there is no precision as well. Americana defined by baseball games and hot dogs. The U.S. soccer team won that year, so they had to come into it because they were definitely part of the news. And then it freezes. And then I'll show you one more. This is climate change. So this is the most abstract one, but it's about the rising water and the idea of architecture. And this is a very abstract one. It's actually the least narrative of all of the collages. Okay. That is rhetorical landscapes. Now I move on to 2020 and monumental. 2020, I started definitely the first part of the body of work after doing a epic 2-month road trip again in an RV during the height of the pandemic. I had to, my son got into Tulane University and they were going to be in person. He had graduated from college, graduated from high school class of 2020. And my wife and I were trying to figure out how are we going to get him to school. Like he's going to be in person. And I was like, I had been going out in LA and starting to photograph the Black Lives Matter protests and started wanting to be on the street again, really missing like, what is it to make documentary photography at this time? What is it to bear witness? Like really asking those questions to myself again in my relationship to photography. And so when I first made the body of work, this was the first piece I made that I hung in the studio, which was titled Monumental, lowercase, in which it's my kind of poem to America. I'm a huge fan of poetry in a certain way, and I'm always interested in both how fiction and language is so tied to also the idea of creating narrative and story and also interrupting it. And so this idea of using the abstract landscapes as a site became to a focus where the first photograph, these bookends, are the most important part of this idea of the metaphor within the work, because you think by the end, after you get through the middle of Richmond, Virginia, of the incredible protest site of the Robert E. Lee Monument that has since been removed, became an amazing site of collective protest. And so this idea of a sunset was really important to me, because what happens within this bookend and this abstraction is the sun is in the exact same position in both photographs. I've just changed the relationship of the camera and the placement of the camera. So you think in your mind the sun is setting, but the sun hasn't set on racism at all in relationship to this country and how this country operates. And then water throughout it is used as a metaphor of how we are split. So these two falls as a split nation, this tree coming through to split, the monument in the middle, again, the idea of reflection and what all of these kind of mean as a construct, was a way for me to try to deal with the intensity of what the documentary photographs did that I felt still wouldn't describe necessarily this other poetic moment of what was happening within our country. So I wanted to mirror the idea of a poem with a very distinct documentary body of work. So these are the individual photographs from Monumental. And using abstraction as also a play, again, of not just the pause, but how abstract the intensity of rhetoric is within our country and the division that we have within our country. So I made all of these individual photographs. I spent 2 months in an RV going around pretty much through the South. The map, so it begins, the beginning of the body of work is, photographing the Black Lives Matter protests in LA. And then there's the map of how I'm going to map out the South, because I'm dropping Oliver off in New Orleans and at Tulane University. So I'm going to map out what monuments remain, what monuments have been removed through the South, and try to get an image of America at the same time of like the road trip 1999 or the road trip of Domestic, where I did lesbian domesticity. But the road trip is a profound place. Now everybody's asking me, Kathy, are the blue and the red tabs about Democrats, Democratic space and Republican space? No, it was just the tabs I had to mark out the map. So it just worked out. It happened to be red-blue tabs I had in the RV, but there is no significance to the amount of red tabs to the blue tabs. If any of you are thinking of that metaphor with me, no, I didn't intend it. Diptych, why diptychs? They were going to be single photographs, and I was editing it as single photographs, and I felt that a single photograph wasn't going to work now. That a single photograph isn't actually that interesting to try to discuss the politics of our time. That in a divided nation, that the diptych would be the space of the in-between in relationship to creating dialogue around documentary photography. That there has to be a dialogue that begins to be kind of ensued within it to understand also that discourse needs to be constantly moving forward. How do I think about racism at my age as being a 63-year-old woman growing up in Ohio and then moving to California? Again, metaphorically, it begins to be like the first introduction, obviously, in a very ill-educated world that we have lived in relationship to the atrocities of our own country, is the documentary, is the mini-series on TV, Roots. And so the second piece in it is these idea that, well, the roots are being shown now. The roots are completely visible. And then here is all of these people in the water during the pandemic on a very hot day in August in the Ozarks. So just the relationship of the body and landscape, and the idea of bodies coming together where bodies would have to be separated and so forth. Within this one, there is different states did different things. I don't have my notes with me, so unfortunately I can't tell you the specificity of the top photograph, but I do believe it's South Carolina. North Carolina completely removed their monuments. South Carolina shrouded them. And so this idea that the monument is also this body that's shrouded within the memorial from the Robert E. Lee Memorial in Virginia. So how does this conversation begin to take place? The idea that this woman who came out for a cigarette break is showing me on her phone what used to remain in that blank grassy area, but then what happens to the diptych that what used to be remained ends up being kind of transposed on the Stonewall Jackson monument from Richmond, Virginia, that the statue has been removed, but the plinth still stands. So why are the plinths still standing in a certain way? Decided social media became a very part of it. Why I wanted to go on this road trip was because of the initial beginnings of the protests at Richmond, Virginia, which blew my mind. So this is a screenshot from somebody's social media. And then me photographing the television set during the vice presidential debate in which the fly landed on Pence's head, which was really the most talked about moment of the debate. And how sad is that? How sad is that? That we all of a sudden find amusement of a fly versus the content of how we want our, our country to be within the world. The memorial of Breonna Taylor with then this beautiful moment happened all the time. I spent about 2 days really documenting the entirety of the Richmond, Virginia site of the Robert E. Lee. And while I was there, I had numerous cameras with me, and family members would ask me to do their family portrait because they were coming from all over the country to bear witness and have this moment with their children to talk about how radical this was as a movement of Black Lives Matter. And so what happens also within this diptych is these colors begin to play off of one another. And what I find is really amazing is this amazing face of Breonna Taylor in relationship to the mother's face. And look at what just happened this past week. I mean, this is atrocious of what just happened with Sonia. From Portland, Oregon, which was one of the most amazing activist sites as well during this time of 2020, there's a lot of mural paintings of George Floyd. And so one of the things that I'm talking about in relationship to this is the idea of American vernacular within poverty. And why did George Floyd really die by the hands of the police is not only in relationship to race, but also class. And, and so this idea of this eye with then, this site of what one would think of as in American vernacular as almost Appalachian kind of photography that we would think of from the WPA administration of Walker Evans and stuff. How do these images exist within our field of thinking about history? And can we have a different kind of discourse in relationship to that? So the diptych begins to try to create those dialogues and conversations. This is, front page news. I've always been photographing newspapers, so still counting. And then I went to a really weird party in a utopic community in California called Sea Ranch, which is only really for the more wealthy now. And it was the pandemic, so we were being served goldfish in blue-gloved hands. And it was just part of my journey in my life at that point. Again, this idea of the ocean and using the horizon, using that space of land, the in-between, and then the Confederate flag in an RV. To one of the most powerful sites that I've ever been to is the relationship of this memorial, in which every county in the South on these, you enter it and they start from the ground and eventually they hang over your head of all the lynchings in those counties in relationship to the names being engraved on here. And then that is in relationship to this ongoing monument in Louisiana in New Orleans that then during BLM, it says, sorry, I know what it says, but I'm going to forget, and I want to get it right, commissioned by Klansmen. So this idea that we're trying to grapple with this history in relationship to this, but that this history still is remaining within the landscape. To then, like the idea of an invasive plant such as kudzu taking over the South and that landscape is still as evasiveness as racism. And this is a scene that I wandered upon at Duke University, in which this woman was graduating and her daughter is on the front steps with her, an African-American woman. And in here, in this chapel, used to be a Confederate monument that was removed. And so this idea that I just happened upon this graduate moment was just another thing that happens within documentary photography. You don't know what you're going to get until you're there. So yes, I watched the Republican National Convention on my iPad in my RV. And then this happens to be Melania over the Daughters of the Confederacy, which is their headquarters. and it had just been tried to be burned down in a protest, but you can see that it was completely protected as a bizarre mausoleum. To high school, Robert E. Lee High School, the removing of a monument there, but not. To high school football players. To Lincoln's boyhood home with this relief, and then putting the diptych of the relief of the chains of slavery being broken next to the activist site of the Robert E. Lee, because the chains of slavery, it's questionable, right? And just the road trip photograph. This is a very weird private monument behind somebody's home. This weird little mound, and so just the relationship of roads well traveled and this kind of just aesthetically what they do with one another. The country club that I went to as a kid in Poway, California has become a site of abandonment and destruction with horrible racist things spray painted all over the walls during this time that and then what does this mean with the white picket fence and this large cross on the front porch? Again, swamp with monument. Then with every body of work, I kind of end the body of work in relationship to optimism. So in and around home, you'll see a rainbow, you'll see an LAPD helicopter on the last pages with then a rainbow kite. And so this is the idea of the cobwebs of everything metaphorically that catches us, but that there's these monuments that are ascended in relationship to nature by human beings. So this is just a rock face for climbers. And that is 2020. Okay, I'm out of time. Should I keep going, or do you want to go to questions? Keep going? Okay. I just want to be aware that I ran out of time and I didn't get through everything. Walls, Windows, and Blood was made in Rome, and I was given a residency that the Mapplethorpe Foundation supported. Thank you, Mapplethorpe Foundation, to go to Rome for 6 weeks and make a body of work. And these are the beginning of the installation shots of how the body of work ended up being exhibited for the first time in Naples. So this is at Thomas Dane Gallery in Naples. The walls are all photographed with a panorama camera. My great architect, also happens to be my girlfriend, Kati Barkin, made these marble plinths because I wanted that to play with the idea of the plinth, and that the wall didn't have the right to be hung on the wall. That do we question whether or not walls come down at this point? What are these walls? How do we begin to think about these structures? So Walls, Windows, and Blood uses the Vatican Museum as a site to begin to critique the Catholic Church. And so you have these walls in between these columns. How do we think about these spaces on an architectural level? How do we break these spaces? These are all the outside points that go in and come out in terms of the Vatican. So you'll see that each one goes in or comes out because those are the points of the walls around the entire Vatican. This is titled No Apology. This is every Sunday. The Pope appears in the window here as a little postage stamp Pope. And this was the day most of all of his addresses are in Latin. And I was with some scholars from the American Academy who spoke Latin, and they were like, he's talking about the children today, Kathy. I don't know what he's saying, but he's talking about the children. And so I would always go home after being in the square and read the transcript of what the Pope was saying. And this was the first time that the Pope acknowledged from the Vatican the indigenous children in Canada in relationship to the horrific removal of them from their homes and forced education, where so many of the children died. And they were forced from the ages of 3 to 15 to no longer live in their tribes or in their family. And there were mass graves found. At this point, when he didn't apologize, but he's later done an apology tour. When he first mentioned it on this day from the window, there was only 78 bodies found at this point. Now it's in the hundreds and thousands in relationship to these indigenous children. So what is this space? How do we begin to define this architecture of what this does? And so I begin to try to break that down just through the simplicity of the language of looking at the actual architecture of the Vatican. So these blood grids are a way to begin to talk about the history of violence and this idea of blood and body and this whole kind of Christianity around it. And I'm obviously no stranger to using blood within my own work. And so these are made from, I photographed every single representation of blood within the art of the Vatican. And then I photographed every single window in the Vatican Museum looking out. And then I photographed every point of the walls. So this idea of my holy trinity of walls, windows, as blood begins to try to break down this larger idea of what Catholicism has done in relationship to really a larger humanity and beginning to critique it. And these are the windows looking out. Sometimes they look onto Rome. Sometimes they look onto the Vatican. And windows nowadays in relationship to language is also play on the idea of transparency. What is transparency? And also the fact that the Vatican is a city within a city. The Vatican has, it doesn't have to go by the laws of Rome. It's a city within its own city. And, I really, doing a body of work of American cities that dealt with the specificity of identity was kind of this body of work followed up being able to think about that, as well as a conversation with the modernists, as well as rhetorical landscapes. So these are all ongoing conversations right now of how to take photography and create a larger kind of language around its relationship to the body politic of the time that I'm living in. This is my self-portrait in it. So there I am in the reflection. I'll just go through these fast because I have a feeling that Heather put individuals in here too. So these are just the installation shots. And it showed in Naples, in Norway, and in New York. And then here are the walls. For those people who want to know what camera, it's a Hasselblad X-Pan. So it's a 35 millimeter panorama. And it's interesting because I always think of my American cities and the black and white photographs so part of like kind of the history of banality within work, of thinking about the Beckers and thinking of all of this. But when you're standing before them, they're not as banal as when you're looking at them in slides. They really do this magical thing when you're in front of them. And that's always the hardest thing about showing photographs is I make installations, and the physicality and the scale of the work is so incredibly important to the work that it doesn't ever really translate that well. But it was really great to reach back into making film. I really love the idea that they're grainy. I like the idea of black and white photography as in terms of thinking about Rome and how it's been photographed and that history. These are the plinths. The marble was, we got them, they were made in Naples for the show. And these are just some of the pictures of the windows. So the windows have all these wonderful marks and makes on them. They show sky, they show age, they show like kind of what's around them. but they're also portraits, right? They're also, the verticality really talks about this window and this idea of this history of this place and what we look through. And the other thing is, this was during the pandemic, you guys. So there was nobody in the Vatican Museum. I mean, literally, I didn't have special access. I just bought a ticket, but they hadn't allowed tourists back into Italy. So I just went every day with my camera and made these photographs, and nobody was around me. And then I went back the year later when they reopened everything, and I went through the Vatican, how everybody goes through the Vatican Museum, which is like this. And I was like, oh, this body of work actually never would have been able to be made if there hadn't been a pandemic. But one of my favorite things is like this idea when the city reflects inside the museum, that all of a sudden, for a moment, does the body politic join together within the reflection, within the idea of transparency and governance. This is my geeky one that's all about photography. So below, this is me being a geeky photographer, everybody. Below, what does that remind photographers out there of? Film clip, right? When you printed full negative and then you had that little film clip marks, but it's a radiator. And just all the level of shadow and how that works. It's like really about what photography does, this one. So one of the things that I like about work and making photographs, and then I talked to you guys a little bit about bumping up against the cliche, but also how do we think about photography and representation as what is iconic and what we know? What is our relationship to how we think of the iconic? And so in a certain way, like the windows are not iconic at all of the Vatican. And I love the fact that I focus on it, because does all of a sudden the windows now become iconic? Will people now go to the Vatican Museum and all of a sudden start looking at the windows versus the art within the Vatican? And I love breaking language and space in that way, of paying such close attention to a detail that probably nobody else really thinks about as they're going through. A blood grid. The blood grids are arranged not through the historical way that they lead you through the Vatican, but completely arranged on an aesthetic level. It's just me playing with the idea of the grid. And I love the grid as the idea of a taxonomy, but at the same time, I'm changing the story of the way that we think about the history of Catholicism being presented through these great works in the Vatican by simply kind of editing them, so to speak, creating a new taxonomy. And they're seductive. I like making sexy work. I think these are kind of sexy. And I have trigger warnings around my self-portraits, but why aren't there any trigger warnings in relationship to this? That's a big question I have. This is the only moment where it's a true narrative within the grid, in which this sword is going to go through this child's brain within this tapestry. So that's the only moment that I set up a correlation within the grid of what I was actually seeing within the museum. Norway mountains and vernacular landscapes. This is a little, the vernacular landscape just came in, and I did this piece for this publication that I'm going to forget the name of. But anyway, this was the edit for it. And so I haven't edited this body of work formally yet. This is just the beginning of it. But I went to Norway and traveled for 20 days chasing the blue and trying to make portraits of mountains. And so these are the beginnings of that body of work. And then in between are these kind of documentary photographs that are dealing with, well, we know what American vernacular is, but what is it in relationship to when we go to other places, and the notion of place and identity and the specificity of that within a culture versus a person who's an American traveling through chasing the blue. So I'm playing with the idea of vernacular a little bit within this. But these are very large prints. They're probably about the scale that's on the screen, actually. And then this would be kind of the 11 by 14 print counteraction of like the vernacular. This is a body of work that I wanted to make for 10 years, and I never could because I was always teaching. So now that I retired, the first thing I did was like make sure that I went to Norway to chase the blue. And the blue is about mourning. It's about climate change. It's about a state of being. It's about discovering that light that is so hard to capture. It's a very, very hard thing to do. And it's about the fact that these mountains as portraits are what the various communities live with as their kind of also known faces in a way. And that in relationship to snow and mountains, especially being a person who lives in California and is completely in love with the Sierras and have a house at the foot of the Sierras on the west side, really aware of the value of water in relationship to how these mountains provide, entire cities and communities with water. Norway will be a place that won't run out of water. I said if Trump is elected, I'm moving to Norway and living on a fjord in a little cabin and staring out at these landscapes all day long because it'll make my heart a lot better than thinking about this person becoming our president again. But I have hope. So this is real light. This is not manipulated. There is no post-production. It is straight out of the camera, straight onto printing. And this is about 3:20 in the afternoon, so this is dusk. So it was predominantly dawn and dusk, and I worked about 5 hours a day in about, between 5 below and 13 below temperatures. Very hard to keep your cameras working in those conditions. And then this is the other relationship to the vernacular. I showed a photograph in class today of Callahan. And remember that kind of abstraction? Like, remember, this moment is, again, how I talk to you guys about how different photographs live in your brain. Then all of a sudden, you realize that you're making something that is part of your language. Well, like today, now that I showed you that Callahan photograph, I realize I'm probably having a conversation with Callahan. Another mountain. So vernacular in the idea of Norwegian, when I typed in Googled what is Norwegian vernacular photography, they said sodded roofs of houses. So there's your sod roofs. I think that sometimes I love to make such kind of meditative work in relationship to nature and having these road trips and these experiences that I find often that I need to ground it back in documentary. And I think that's what these ideas of Norwegian vernacular is beginning to do, where it's like I don't want anything to be too pretty, even though I really love how beautiful they are. I have this little guilty person on the side of me going that, Kathy, too pretty. And even though I really like that, it's just like I try to interrupt that often within the work I find. And then here's the first mountain I found in Norway on the edge of just like snow piling up from them clearing the sidewalk. And I just thought that was really funny. Okay, this is it. This is the installation. It's up right now to October 27th. If you need to see this, go to Brazil. It'll only be in Brazil. An amazing architect by the name of Lina Bobardi with her husband built this museum in Sao Paulo, Brazil called MASP over 70 years ago. Lina Bobardi and her husband were exiled as leftists. They exiled from Italy to Brazil to be part of the kind of socialist leftist community. And her husband, being very wealthy, started buying post-World War II some of the great masters of the world to bring that work to Brazil. And in building this museum, she designed this specificity of hanging the collection that is normally above the museum because the museum is suspended. It's a really interesting architecture. And do your own research on it because I could go on about it, but it would be better if Kati went on about it, actually. Because I was said to her, I was like, "Hun, like MASP called me and they want me to do a show," and she was like, "Are you fucking kidding me?" Like, so she has a lot to say about it. But these plinths are also about transparency, and I find that so interesting that it follows like something like Walls, Windows, and Blood, because the way that the work is hung is on these designed concrete blocks of hers that have this wedge of wood and rubber that hold this glass so that all the work floats within the space. And the collection is predominantly a figurative collection. And so the first time in the history of MASP, they've allowed a contemporary artist to do an exhibition that they sought me out for, to have a conversation of my queer work with their old masters collection. And so it's 21 of their old masters paintings, from Titian to Holbein to Goya to Rembrandt to Monet and on, every name you could imagine, in relationship to my history of queer portraiture or family. And so this is Elliot Page. When he reached out to me to do the cover of his book Page Boy, it was because of this portrait I did of Pigpen in 1992. And Elliot said, "I want you to, kind of replicate the portrait of Pigpen for my book." And Elliot commissioned me to do that. And so for the first time ever is the portrait of Pigpen and Elliot hung together. But you'll notice that the beauty of the installation is the idea of the plinth as a body, with the bodies hanging on the body, the idea of the transparency that you see through it. And it's really one of the most emotional experiences I've ever had with my work as an artist. This is, you just saw this portrait earlier of Justin Bond, made in 1993, but this is with a Modigliani. And then this is the last image, and it's Goya with Pervert. And thank you all for coming, and I'll be very happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Kathy. If anyone has any questions, I can bring the mic to you.
We can turn on the house lights so I can see faces.
Hello.
Hey, Monty.
A lot of your work seems almost deceptively simple, but has layers of complexity to it. Are you ever worried that your audience won't engage with the work to the level of effort or references that you put into it?
You can't have that expectation of the audience. All you can do is think that the bodies of work that you're making are going to tell a story throughout your life in relationship to your ideas and what you're thinking. And there are going to be people that follow along in a really deep level. And then there's other people that are just going to look and go on, like you see everybody do in any museum or exhibition where. But do I want to hold people, and I would like them to go deeper because I think there's a deeper level to go if you choose to. But I also am so tied in with the formality of the way that I make images that I know that it also can be just an aesthetic experience if that's where people want to go.
Hi, Kathy. Thank you so much. Wanted to ask a question about the abstract photographs of nature, or the out of focus. And I'm wondering about your process there. Are you out looking for that photograph, or are you taking that? Are you thinking, because you talked about how the sunset was very important, and I'm wondering if you had the idea ahead of time for that entire series, or if you're just picking that moment to take that out of focus photograph.
Well, I seek it. I seek light. I seek different atmospheres. I seek location. I mean, I think that you guys could identify, even though all of them are untitled, that that was Niagara Falls. So I flew to Niagara Falls to make an abstract photograph of Niagara Falls. Now, whether or not you're going to get the light or anything that you want, it just depends on how long you're going to hang out and if it's raining or whatever. But you know, obviously I make thousands, like for Norway, just to give you an example, that body of work will probably be edited down to maybe 15 of the vernacular, 10 of the large landscapes, and maybe 10 more of a different size landscape for the body of work. And that is, you know, potentially maybe 30 photographs out of 2,000 photographs made within a 20-day period of time. So when I'm working really, really hard, but then it comes down to an editing process. And it's always like just the relationship of what the photographs are doing to one another, as well as what's happening with light and all of that. But it is just racking the focus. And it was also a poke at all the kind of contemporary abstract photography that was being done digitally. I was like, well, yeah, I can make abstract photographs, you guys. All I have to do is rack the focus and open my aperture. And then all of a sudden, out of that joke with myself became this like really interesting exploration. So a lot of things might start out as a little like poke at what's happening within conversations that I want to have within contemporary art, and then it turns into something bigger that I find meaning out of.
Hello, thank you. I wanted to ask, how do you know what to photograph?
It's just in my head. I mean, the modernist was, as it drove my assistant, Heather. I've had a same assistant for 13 years, and when we made the modernist, she bugged me every day. She goes, well, where's the storyboard for it? And I'm like, it lives in my head. And she goes, well, how do I know what to do when we get to set? And I said, there is no set. There's me with a camera, and it's Piggy. And we have some lights, and we just make it, and I'm going to just make it. And she goes, but don't we need to have a plan? And I'm like, no, we're just going to make it because it lives in my head. So basically, my work is trying to answer the larger questions of how I think about the world and my life. And that's all the work is trying to do. I'm not a novelist. I'm not a poet. But all of it comes out of this deep level of interest in humanity and politics and where we are and how we talk about our times and how photography begins to serve that in different ways in relationship to either a position, a place, or a feeling. And that gets all wrapped up and together in different moments, where some moments I need to wander off into Norway and have a blue experience, and other times I have to be on the road like photographing Americana. And those are different questions and different things, but they all actually are a larger part of the path of what I'm trying to traverse.
Kathy, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. And remember, give to the ranch, give to the ranch.